All right, guys, we're back, and today we're taking a look at World War II and specifically the home front. A lot of attention is given to D-Day and the dropping of the atomic bomb and Pearl Harbor and all of these kind of major battles and events that take place in the war, and with good reason, right? The men who were fighting did an incredible job, and they certainly deserve our respect. However, it's also important that we take a look at the home front. So we're going to take a look at how this affected life, what we were doing here, and how we were helping to win the war from the home front. So we're going to start off by taking a look at the fact that in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, right, hundreds of thousands of men are going to volunteer for service. You couldn't hardly beat your way into a recruiting station. People were lined up out the door, down the street, and around the block. There were so many people who kind of took this very personally, right? This was an attack on their country, and we're very patriotic people. And so they wanted to do their part to help the country win, especially against an enemy that had taken advantage of a peacetime attack. So a lot of people are going to volunteer. When the war begins, right, on the day that that Pearl Harbor is struck, we only have about 300,000 men total in our military. But we're going to wind up, between the draft and volunteers, wind up with about 16 million men in uniform, fighting this war, doing the logistics, moving people from place to place, but an absolutely enormous military presence. And that all starts with Pearl Harbor. So a lot of people are going to war. Now, in order to go to war, those men, those 16 million men that get drafted or volunteer, they're going to need boots and helmets and guns and rifles and canteens, and they're going to need all the things that you need to fight war and live on the front. And that means that production is going to get kicked into high gear, not just for those things, but also the bigger war machines, right? The things like the aircraft, the bombers and the fighters. You're going to need tanks and jeeps and the big deuce and a half, the trucks that would carry cargo or men to different places on the battlefront. You're going to need ships. And so U.S. industry really begins to shift from consumer production, making toasters and radios and that sort of thing, to making wartime goods. And so they're going to try to kind of make that shift. Now, it immediately lifts the U.S. out of the Depression. All of a sudden, factories are springing back to life. Men are employed by the U.S. government and the military. And so if you want a job during this time, you can have two. It's a 180-degree turnaround from where we were in the Depression. A lot of companies really make this shift in hiring and production. And we see things like automotive manufacturers. They're going to shift from making consumer cars to making tanks or planes. Companies that were making radio or small electronics are going to start to make military-grade radio equipment, communications equipment. So you see a lot of those things. This is an interesting ad here because it's from Chevy, and it's really touting that, listen, they're doing their part. You couldn't buy a 1943 Chevy anything because it didn't exist. They were making military goods. And so here they are kind of reminding you of that, so that when the war is over, there's kind of a sense of loyalty, a return to normalcy, and people may be more willing to buy Chevy products because of how big Chevy was during the war. There's all sorts of examples like that. Now, what we're going to see is, and this is a good example here, is the aircraft production. Our industrial output, our industrial capacity was huge. Remember, the war wasn't being fought on U.S. soil. And so that means that our factories aren't being bombed by the Germans. We're not losing ground to the Germans. And so this shows kind of all the major countries that are involved and the aircraft production. And we started to ramp it up here, but by the time we get hit in 1941, look at what happens to our production. We outpace everybody by a good bit. We're able to really churn those things out. And that is to our benefit because those things are going to really help us to win the war. The same is true of ship production. 1941, when we get hit, all of a sudden we have to repair or replace many of those ships. And whether, regardless of the type of ship, we are producing a ton. The only other two that are on this are Britain and Japan. They would have been major manufacturers of ships because they're both island nations. The United States, though, outpaces them both put together by a factor of I don't even know what, right? But it's a significant margin. So America's industries are thriving and they are making massive amounts of goods. And that leads us to women. And we all know Rosie the Riveter, right? This very, very famous poster from World War II. Women are going to join the war effort. And they're going to join the war effort in many ways, probably the most prominent of which is in the workforce. With millions of men going off to fight the war, they leave behind them this void, these vacant jobs. And so the country is really looking to fill those jobs. In fact, we need not only the jobs that they left behind, but millions of other jobs that are being created by this war effort. And you couldn't find enough people to fill them all. So there began to be this big push to hire women. So there we see that prior to the war, you had about 3 million women in the workforce. By the time the war hits its peak, we're at about 19 million women. This is a big, big jump. And women are going to do, in many cases, they're going to do some of the very heavy industrial work, which a few short years ago, they were thought incapable of doing. Here are welders. And of course, we know Rosie the Riveter. Here's a picture of a kind of depiction of Rosie the Riveter on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. That's a Norman Rockwell depiction. And so these women really are kind of immortalized and lifted up for the role that they played in helping us to win the war. They worked on planes. They worked in shipyards. They worked in manufacturing and munitions plants. They did all sorts of things, including working in the military itself. The WACs, the Women's Army Corps, even in the Army, well, we didn't have an Air Force at that time, but we were starting to move in that direction. You had the WASPs, the Women's Auxiliary Service Pilots. They would fly planes from manufacturing facilities to military bases and kind of shuttle things back and forth in that way. There are a lot of different jobs, even in the military. Now, they never served in combat, but they would serve in secretarial or administrative roles. They would serve as nurses. They would serve in transportation roles. There were a lot of different things that women could do in the military. And again, we're going to see nurses. There was a massive push for nurses because they were needed. There were going to be a lot of wounded. There were going to be a lot of men who needed care. And so there was a big push for women to become nurses to serve their country in that way. And millions joined the cause. They answered the call. So here we see again, with the more women at work, the sooner we win. These propaganda posters were everywhere, and there were millions of these things. The reality is, I think we win the war, and this is to take nothing away from the men who fought. They did an incredible job. There's a reason this is called the greatest generation, not just the greatest generation of men or the greatest generation of soldiers, but the greatest generation, because I think we win this war largely because of our industrial output. And that output is made possible by women in industry, or at least in large part by women in industry. So women kind of served as our secret weapon. We were using women in this wartime economic setting that maybe others were not to the same extent. So really kind of an important part. They played an often unrecognized or unheralded role in helping us to win this war. Now, the war is also going to result in a lot more opportunity for not just women, but also African Americans who play a massive role. They're going to find jobs in the military and in industry. And so here we see some of those in the military ranks. This is an image of the Tuskegee Airmen. This is an all-black unit, a very, very well-respected all-black unit. They were responsible for downing over 400 enemy aircraft. Now, when this unit first started, there were a lot of naysayers that thought they couldn't learn all the ins and outs of the aircraft, that they couldn't be pilots as well as anybody else. But when given a chance, they really excelled. And I would have to assume that this would instill a lot of pride. It would be a great recruitment tool for other Black Americans in the country that can see how well they're performing. They can see that they are matching and exceeding those of their white counterparts in many places, and that would instill an awful lot of pride. So you did see other all black units. The Army was very segregated at that time, and they fought in segregated units, but they did have the opportunity to fight nonetheless. Now, some of the roles that they served were interesting to say the least, because things like the Tuskegee Airmen, that was the outlier. Far more often, you were going to see African Americans serve in roles as cooks and kind of roles like that, which is unfortunate. But that was the reality of wartime in the military for African Americans at that time. Now, FDR is going to sign an executive order. It's Executive Order 8802, and what this does is it's trying to fill those factory jobs. We had factory jobs that we could not fill, and we had hired women. We had hired all the white men that we could that weren't going off to war. There were still more jobs to be filled. And so Executive Order 8802 eliminates discriminatory hiring practices in the government and in all industries that receive government contracts. So if your factory wanted to get lucrative government contract work, then you had to show them that you were not being discriminatory in your hiring practices. That meant that a lot of jobs are going to open up for the African American community. Now, what we will see is that black employment doubles during World War II. It opens up a ton of opportunity. And these opportunities, whether it be in the military or in industry, I think are often sowing the seeds of that civil rights movement. Here we see African-American gentleman carrying a picket sign, right? If Negro men can carry guns for Uncle Sam, surely they can drive milk wagons for Bowman Dairy. And we start to see this, the roots, the seeds of that civil rights movement that will come a decade later. Oh, there we go. In fact, African Americans are going to engage in what's called the Double V campaign. Double V, V for victory, right? Today we think that's the peace sign. Well, back in World War II, that was the sign for victory. And the Double V campaign, African Americans were fighting racism abroad in the military, fascism abroad in the military, but they were fighting racism at home. And so they were kind of fighting on two fronts. It's kind of an interesting juxtaposition to be fighting for someone else's rights when your rights at home are not being respected or freely given. Now, as we continue to look at other minority groups, millions of Mexicans are going to find work through what's called the Bracero program. We needed workers, particularly in the Southwest, and so there were a lot of Mexicans that became part of the Bracero program. They could come across the border and work every day, or they could migrate to the United States, and they got a kind of a temporary worker visa, an opportunity to work in the United States to fill those jobs that we so desperately needed. And so we're bringing in workers from other places. That's how great a need there was for workers. Native Americans, that's another group that rose to the call and really filled a significant void. They served in larger percentage, right? A greater percentage of the Native American population served than any other ethnic group in the country. About 1 in 3 fighting-aged Native American men are going to sign up for military service. And many of those are going to become what are called the code talkers. These are people who speak their native languages. Often we think of the Navajo people, but because their languages developed very independently of kind of Germanic or Latin roots or whatever the case may be, they could speak in their native languages fairly openly and decode or translate that language, and there wasn't much risk of it being intercepted. Actually, it was a great risk of it being intercepted, but they were never decoded. And so it was a very effective way of communicating important messages across enemy lines. These men did a huge service to their country by doing that. Now, if we're talking about the home front, we have to talk about scarcity and rationing because all of a sudden there's a massive need. Americans are being asked to conserve food, to conserve oil and gas. They're asked to reduce the amount that they use and make things last a little bit longer. All of this is a concerted effort at kind of aiding the war effort because, as this poster suggests, when we do with less, they'll have enough. And so we want to make sure that the whole country is participating. You start to see things like this with gas rationing. When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. Join a car sharing club today. You were actually not even allowed to get gas just any old time. You had a gas ration card, which meant you were limited on when you could buy gas, and you were limited on the amount of the number of gallons that you could buy. And it was based on where you lived, where you worked, some of your other needs. If you were in transportation and you were moving, you're a truck driver, right? Then you pretty much got unlimited gasoline rations because you were probably moving wartime goods or raw materials to where they needed to be. But if you were just a regular person working a wartime job, they would give you what you needed and very little else. So you had to really be aware. There were no more, people used to like taking kind of long Sunday drives and just kind of get fresh air and get out. That wasn't allowed anymore, right? You didn't have the gasoline to do that. They also rationed things like rubber. So you couldn't take those extra drives because it would cause too much wear and tear on your tires and you'd have to have them replaced and you weren't allowed to do that. Oh, what else? Save your cans, right? Resources are going to be, again, highly controlled and rationed to ensure that the military has what it wants. And I love this poster. So I'm going to zoom in on this. You've got what looks like a lady's arm reaching out there with old tomato soup cans or whatever the case may be, and it's being fed directly into a machine gun because that tin or that aluminum, whatever the metals made from those cans, or other scrap metals, were going to be able to be recycled and be used directly in the war effort. And so here we see they've got guts, back them up with more metal. We're going to see there were massive scrap drives that were done community wide. They'd go door to door and ask you to, if you can do without it, give us what you've got. We're going to take it to be recycled. Coal, iron, steel, gas, meat, rubber, nylon, tin, grains, aluminum, coffee, so much were going to be rationed and tightly controlled that life became a little bit challenging. We're used to being able to buy whatever we want, whenever we want, as long as we've got the money to do it. Back then, that was not the case because there were such shortages. My wife's grandmother likes to tell the story about how you couldn't find nylons, right? Hose for women, which you weren't a lady without hose, right? You had to have that. But they were in such short supply that when they had a girlfriend who worked at a department store downtown, she'd let them know, she'd give them a heads up when a limited shipment was coming in, and they would spend the night at the store in order to be the first in line to get those. And you were only allowed to buy 2 pairs, so they were going to go quickly. Just fascinating way of living life. People who sacrificed so much, both here at home and on the battlefront. So each month, ration books, and this is what they would look like. Ration books would be sent out. And these stamps weren't used in place of money, right? You had so many coffee rations, you had so many meat rations, grain rations, and you didn't spend them like money. It didn't replace cash. It went along with cash. So the price might be, 50 cents a pound for a pot roast, but it also cost 6 meat rations per pound. And so if you were out of meat rations at the end of the month, well, too bad. You don't get to buy any more meat. Things were tightly controlled. You could save them up from month to month if you wanted to. You could trade these things with other people, but you weren't allowed to make purchases. In fact, it was illegal for stores to sell you certain products without not only the cash but the accompanying ration stamps. So it really is kind of an interesting thing to experience there. Rationing means a fair share for all. You started to see some black market popping up where people were kind of trading stuff or selling stuff under the table without the ration stamps, but that was highly discouraged. And in fact, if it was discovered, you were really kind of ostracized because you weren't doing your part. Everybody had somebody fighting in this war. Everybody knew somebody who was going to war. And by not participating in this, you were putting them in danger. You were risking their lives. You weren't doing your part. Why? Because you were selfish and you just wanted more meat to eat or more coffee or more butter or whatever the case may be. So a lot of social pressure to really conform and to do so more or less with a smile on your face because this is what we have to do in wartime. People are going to be encouraged to grow victory gardens and to can their own food, because the more we produce in our backyards or in community gardens, the more the commercial farmers can send to industrial canning that can be sent overseas. That stuff will make it over there. And so if we can produce our own food, if we can produce our own produce and can it, then we're going to be way ahead of the game. And so I just found this one today, right? You got a soldier leaning over the fence, home on leave, talking to his neighbor. I see we're fighting the war together, right? Plant a victory garden. And notice that this was from the Pennsylvania Railroad. This wasn't from the United States government. There's a lot of propaganda that comes from the U.S. government, but you had companies also urging their employees to do what was necessary to help win the war, to be a proper citizen. Here we see, we'll have lots to eat this winter, won't we, mother? Grow your own, can your own. A lot of pressure to do that. And they would send out pamphlets that would explain how, that would teach you how, so that even if you had no experience doing it, you were able to. Americans are also going to be urged to support the war by buying war bonds. We saw that in World War I as well, but the idea is this war is expensive and the government needs you to help fund the war. And so they really urged people to not just buy war bonds periodically, but to pledge 10% of your income. I mean, after all, there's not a lot of commercial goods or consumer goods out there for you to buy. So you might as well save your money, invest it in something that's going to be worthwhile and help bring our soldiers back sooner. Here, this is a pretty powerful one. I gave a man. Will you give at least 10% in war bonds? So a major push. Society, you want to talk about a total war. Everything was geared at winning this. We were encouraged to find war jobs, whether you were women, whether you were African American, if you were white male, it didn't matter. Find a war job. Here's this lady. I found the job where I fit best. And this soldier, get a war job to help him fight, right? See the nearest U.S. employment service. There was plenty of work for everybody. And again, this is a good time for us to talk about all those propaganda posters, because they were everywhere. They were murals on the sides of buildings. They were at every post office, every grocery store. They were hanging in churches. I mean, you name it. These messages were everywhere. They demonized the enemy. They explained or tried to explain why we're fighting and what it was going to take to win. They shaped and influenced our behaviors. To buy war bonds and grow victory gardens and get a war job and conserve this or that, and just really participate in every facet of our life. So here we see, don't let that shadow touch them. The growing threat of the Nazi symbol on our American children. Buy war bonds, right? We've got to protect them. Give them the stuff to fight with. Work for freedom. Again, encouraging industrial workers, saying those, and they recognize fully that those industrial workers were just as important in this fight as the soldiers were. That the soldiers can't do their job if you won't do yours. We were also encouraged to shut up about some things. We were worried about spies. And so if you had if you got orders, or you had a husband or a brother or a family member that got orders about when to ship out or where they were going to be stationed, you didn't talk about it at all. Because that could put them at risk. If that was overheard by the wrong people, we were concerned about spies. If that was overheard by the wrong people, then that careless talk could cost lives. If the enemy knows and gets word of when somebody is shipping out, then submarines could be lurking in the waters off the coast. And that did happen. So here we see, I think, a really interesting, it's this guy talking to his girl, right? Talking about maybe where he's going to be shipping out or where he's going to be stationed. And you've got Hitler sitting next to him, one big ear kind of poking out there, listening, because information is power. And we want to make sure that it's tightly controlled. To that end, the fear and paranoia of spies, we also had fear and paranoia that were driving other situations, like Japanese internment camps. This is one of the darkest things that happens on U.S. soil during the war. Really a terrible thing. In fact, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention it, but this is big enough that it warrants its own video. So I'll do another short video that deals with Japanese internment. Make sure that you're looking for that. But for now, at least you have a little bit of an understanding of what life on the home front looked like, how it was different than the way we live today. Guys, I hope you learned something. I hope it brought a better understanding of World War II to you and how it wasn't just the soldiers in this fight. Make sure you subscribe, give me a like, and leave me messages. I'd love to hear more. There may be some things that I missed, so help me out. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it.